So, hello everyone, and welcome to this stage conversation. My name is Markus Reymann. I'm the director of TBA 21 Academy, and I'm here today with María Montero Sierra, head of program of the Academy and curator of this episode on stage, to talk with artist Sonia Levy and her collaborator, the anthropologist Anne Swanson. So, welcome. TBA 21 Academy has the pleasure to present Sonia Levy's last film, Creatures of the Lines, on the TBA 21 platform stage for a month, and then a shorter version will remain. Creatures of the Line is a new film by artist Sonia Levy, produced in collaboration with the environmental anthropologist Heather Swanson. It explores how desire for economic growth and linear progress have structurally reshaped English waterscapes. Sonia, my opening question is for you, because throughout your work, you work collaboratively and very often involve other disciplines. And so this is a multi-pronged question. Where does this interest come from? 2, how do the conversations start? And 3, how do you actually facilitate these collaborations in a way that languages are understood? Because very often when we talk amongst disciplines, we use the same words, but have very, very, very different meanings.
I think a need to see art as being part of a larger understanding of a practice knowledge, of being able to see art as a way of inquiring into the world, as a way of thinking how aesthetics and forms of representation matters, how we can perceive those things as generating ways of understanding broader issues. I think also what is important in this idea of interdisciplinarity is how question relating to our current epoch and what one might call the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, nature and culture, we cannot separate those things anymore. We need a broader, more holistic understanding of those issues. Then the second part of your question was relating to where the conversation starts between me and my collaborators. I think it depends, of course, on projects. A lot of the time I would approach certain scientists that I would be specifically interested in the work. And we start there really and seeing how we can collaborate also in a respectful manner, that they would give me the space to maybe challenge some of their conceptions or ways of perceiving or working, or maybe like the ontologies into which they are bound. And I've been very lucky that I found collaborators that were open also to this challenge that maybe I try to bring in my work, but also about bringing longer histories into the present. And sometimes also we start also seeing things differently together. So that changed our conversation as well.
What has driven you to focus in this later film in the Canals? Because you have worked before on ecology very focusedly, also on bodies of waters, and at some instance as well on interspecies communication. But in Creators of the Line, you add a new layer, which is precisely tackling into human action, designing in the form of carving the landscape. And so I was wondering, what have drove you to the canals in general, to their design and functionality, and more specifically to those of England, right?
The focus on canal came more from the commission with Radar. So I was initially approached by Radar Loughborough, which is an art organization located on the Loughborough campus. which facilitate exchange between art and research. And they wanted me to broadly work on a project on risk and water and ecology. And so they got me to meet local geographers and freshwater ecologists. And then it was through meeting some of those geographers, and specifically Paul Wood, who became an important collaborator in the project, that issues around newly arrived aquatic species in man-made water body, and specifically how canals are facilitating their dispersal and spread. So that was an important point that was brought to my attention by the local scientist I was in discussion with. And initially, we were going to focus the work more on the East Midlands, where this university is located and where this researcher has based all his work. But with the pandemic, we had to also change the geography of the project. The local water, the water that was basically the closest to me, which were also those basin and canal, but then in London. And I just, spent a lot of time then looking at, their ecological contortion, so to speak. And I began fascinating with how to bring images of those worlds that are, seldom seen. I think there's one other aspect of the project is that I was also interested in how canals don't fall necessarily under any directive or measure to assess their health. They are part of, they cross paths with local rivers and watersheds. So they're still considered infrastructure of transport. So also we felt that there was like missing knowledge there. Like no one really knew what were canals, what were the ecology, what lived in them. And I think they're, not considered alive.
And that particularly touch in the descriptive title of the film, which is directly addressing that extensive aquatic life that is running right through those canals, but yet a fauna and flora that we don't really look at, so don't even enter into in our imaginary. Quite often we associate those same waters with extremely polluted environment. And I think like your work, the footage, so also like, as you say, it's not part of the ocean, it's not part of the canal, and yet you provide with great amplitude an extremely rich environment.
I think you're pointing to something really interesting, and that we tend to think about a place as either like polluted or like abundant. And I think our work is actually showing how a place can be both and at the same time. That it's not that we're trying to show that these canals are lively and abundant and not polluted. On the contrary, we're trying to show that they are precisely both at the same time. And I think that's a sensibility that we've tried to maintain throughout the work, is that these are neither spaces to be wholly condemned or wholly celebrated, that they are a place of complicated pasts and complicated futures. So I think that's a sensibility that runs throughout the film that has been really exciting and has helped to animate our conversations and our inquiry, is how to hold those tensions in view. And I think that is particularly important in relation to the waters that we're exploring, where there are often large numbers of a relatively small number of species. So there is a very particular kind of abundance. This also goes for the waters themselves, that these are, in many cases, the canals are eutrophied, which means that they have very high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, so that there's been a lot of either nutrient runoff, which can come from, say, fertilizer inputs as well as from sewage, maybe landscapes of accumulation, where you have concatenation of wealth from British imperial practice that is then exemplified through the over-richness and certain types of overabundance in the canals, at the same time that there's also absence and species that are not there, and maybe one could say a lack of biodiversity and other types of richness.
I was struck, Sonia, by your comment about saying that there is actually very little knowledge. I imagine scientific knowledge.
Yes.
On the other hand, I know that in the UK, the Canal and River Trust is a highly cherished charity, and I think has many citizens involved in the manicuring and maintenance of these rivers, and canals. Have you been in touch with these more associations, citizen groups in the course of the work as well?
Yes, so I had to get actually a permit to film from the Canal and River Trust because the infrastructure belonged to them, so I wouldn't be allowed for security reason to film underwater without asking them for an authorization. I've also followed the draining of one canal and the cleaning of all the detritus and plastic that is at the bottom and completely melted in the mud from local volunteers. So that was quite impressive. I could witness the sort of also layering of different forms of labor that exist around canal in the UK. And I think the particularity that the Canal and River Trust is today a charity. And I've also been in touch with one of the ecologists who works in the Canal and River Trust, and he told me some of the goal that they're trying to have for canal, which has more to do with what they call habitat enhancement. And so they usually build some of those what is called a floating ecosystem, which is so plants that will be like a little raft where plants have their roots directly in the water. So that helps, so aquatic plants and that helps, supposedly helps removing nutrient from the water and creating shelters.
Yeah, in the film you mentioned now the Corbicula flummea, but we also see the Dreissena, which is a zebra mussel, and it is interesting because we see how they thrive without this thing which what it would be a natural skeleton from infrastructure. And then it says a lot about what is the human action doing into an environment that nonetheless enable those thriving lives underwater.
One of the things that I find really interesting is that various organisms are very good at making distinctions in various ways. And for the organisms in the canal, the differences in textures and the differences in surfaces are often very important to them. For example, Corbicula and Dracaena, it's not that they don't care about the differences in substrates. They actually have a preference. And they often thrive on man-made surfaces, not only concrete, but also, say, around discharge pipes. So whereas other organisms don't thrive on those surfaces and need a different kind of substrate. So rather than creatures that don't care about differences, actually, these are creatures that care about differences quite a lot, which is precisely what makes us, what might seem like small differences from a human perspective, but are very important from different organismal perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really, really struck me when I started filming. And also later on now we are doing a microinvertebrate study actually to figure out a bit more the water quality and understand more about canals through the lens of what lives in them and those assemblage of microinvertebrates.
This, I think, is a really, really interesting point that you're mentioning. Maybe going back to more a general statement about your practice, no, that it is not just about the film and the filmic work, but that you're an integral part of the team of researchers and really working not alongside with them, documenting or looking at the work from a kind of outside perspective, but you're really inside and an integral part of the work itself.
And I think we've reached a point where many scholars, many artists, many practitioners in the world are interdisciplinary. And I think the question now is, what sort of interdisciplinarities do we each bring to a collaboration? And how do we look at the different affordances of bringing people and practices that are already interdisciplinary together in new configurations? And that there's a real question now that rather than asking, are we doing interdisciplinarity or not, to ask what kinds of interdisciplinarities are we enacting and what kinds of assemblages? And I think that's something that's been really exciting for me in working with Sonia, is that because, Sonia, of all of the various marine science projects that you've been involved with throughout your career, is that you're bringing this wealth of knowledge about marine science and aquatic science to the collaboration as well, and including and those are dimensions of your interdisciplinary practice that are only being extended within the collaboration with Loughborough University and with the design of a scientific study on invertebrate life in the canals, which I think only expands the possibilities and scope of ways of thinking across different forms of art research experimentation. That's a really exciting part of thinking through our practice together.
Mm-hmm. No, I couldn't agree more, Heather, and thank you for that comment. No, I think it's also in this understanding or in this sensibilities of the multiples and of disciplines that can inhabit one practice. No, is also something that resonates in your work as well. No, it's kind of to make visible the entanglements, the intersectionalities of these converging crises that we are facing nowadays, no, or that we are living in and through nowadays, and you know, with a, like, let's say, with a description of the climate change or climate crisis as a hyper object. No, there was a kind of an approach of how to approach the subject. But I think in the last at least year or two or three, the notion of the intersectionality, no, has become, and the entanglement has become so prevalent and has been emerging and surfacing more and more. And yet it's a real challenge, no, to really address this intersectionality.
One thing that was really important for us in this project and in the work is its notion of multi-layeredness. We are to grapple with the kinds of complexities that we're trying to engage requires modes of research, modes of representation that have a multi-layeredness built into them?
I think especially in the way I sort of put the project together, which was a difficult project to put together because I had accumulated so much footage, and there was such a disjunction in terms of scale as well, with the sort of globalization and the micro scale of those creatures, and the very situated places Canal have, and there, but at the same time the way that they connect everything. So I think the scientific research into that, and I think the film has those different layers, which is at once it's a journey through Canal from that container port, which is like a sort of image or metaphor for a structure of power and trading, but it's also something real in terms of how it brings about some of those creatures that are then thrown inside Canal. And so we go from that place in the Thames estuary all the way to Canary Wharf, which is the entrance to those inland waterways, and Canary Wharf being also this very strange place, which was the Dockland. So it was also the equivalent of what the container port is today. It was the container, the place, it belonged to the East Indian Company. So it has all this like troubling history. And then it became this financial center. So it became also like this really interesting way for me of thinking about the sort of underbelly of history. And I was really curious about what lived inside Canary Wharf waterways. And they're also much deeper than the rest of the canals because it was built to bringing those ships that would go across oceans. And then from there, we travel through canals into different basins, and we travel mainly to one canal, which is Regent's Canal. And so there is this travel, the geographical travel, this historical travel, also with the narration, and then there is those layers of maybe of a way of grappling or understanding something, which is the scientific processes, the bringing forth also the agency of those creatures that lives in the line, canals as an environment. So the film itself also try to produce, or the camera or the image try also to bring knowledge about canals. So it's not only the scientific that brings the knowledge, but also looking at those underwater space and what exists inside of them.
I think the first thing I want to mention is that one of the real joys of our collaboration has been that Sonia and I are really interested in thinking through the particularity of places. And so the Docklands and Regent's Canal are also very interesting to work with in a historical archival context, because they are sites for which there are multiple records of layered histories. So they are exciting in that there's a wealth of records from which to think and to explore that are not generic, but that are tied to those particular patches. And so we certainly did quite a bit of research and reading about the histories of those particular sites, of going back and trying to find old newspaper articles linked to those canals, to those sites, to those patches, to that basin, and trying to think from those places, not only from a space of sort of theoretical ideas about water or progress, but also trying to think those theoretical and analytical concepts through particular places. And I think that's also part of the commitment to staying in the lines and staying underwater, is that we want to enter spaces and we want to enter conversations, but from a watery perspective, rather than from a sort of abstract, top-down floating perspective. So that was one of the commitments of the project. But then to turn to the texts themselves, the poem that we refer to as I Sing comes from a much earlier time period. That poem comes from responses to a different type of canal building project. So that poem is it relates to the drainage of the fens. And so it's about the use of canals primarily to remove water and to dry out a landscape so that it can be used for larger scale, more increasingly industrialized agricultural production. And it's the part also of the conversion of the fens from a peasant landscape to an enclosed landscape of private property. So it's also about the transition from commons to private property as land was transformed through its drainage. And so that is a different project than the transportation canals that are at the center of our current inquiry, but there's also a profound link. And as Sonia said, we were interested in how voices of concern, voices of opposition to these processes of industrialization and the damages that it creates are not something that only arrives in the present, but that have been part and parcel of debates from the beginning. This poem both has an element of wonder over these new projects and processes, and also concern and worry and anxiety over what effects they might have in the world. So the second verbally performed poem about trade is similarly a poem that has a strong celebratory aspect, but also comes from a work that is deeply ambivalent about transnational trade as well. It's from an anti-slavery poem by William Cooper, an English poet. And the poem was part of an explicit contribution to the anti-slavery movement. And the selection that you hear is a selection from his poem where Cooper is celebrating a certain type of transnational world. I guess it brings a voice of opposition to at least a certain form of trade. And there are multiple ways to read Cooper's overall thoughts. Some have said that although he's critical of the slave trade, he was also not fully critical of projects of British Empire. Yet it's also an exploration of ambivalence and limits.
And another written part that you introduce in the text, and it's just directly say the ocean Tamed, and this reference to an ocean that is governed and reclaimed by us. And it directly, I think it addressed this attempt to govern in the resources of the water, but also I think in a way as well is touching up on regulations of conservation plans. And I thought, like, Heather, that was directly a question for you. What of those assumptions does the film aim to challenge directly?
So that phrase is within the poem about the fens, which is a 17th century poem. So in that context, the phrase ocean tamed is directly alluding to the work of the East India Company, and perhaps also to British naval power, to ruling the seas through both military might and commerce. So we did read it in that spirit in which it was written. So I think Ocean Tamed, as we read it within that historical context, is very much about the projects of transnational trade, of technologies of navigation, of rendering the ocean as a space and conduit for trade, rather seeing it as a medium for capitalist and imperial projects, rather than as a fully lively space. And so I think that's how we were engaging with it in this particular context.
I think there was something also that I thought was really interesting that we discussed, Heather, which but maybe I'm pushing the question here a little bit, but around question about domestication, taming, and ferality, and proliferation, and what the wild is like. That maybe would be really great if you wanted to say something about that.
One thing that's important to us is that, again, it's not that like taming and wildness are fully opposite of each other, but precisely that industrial projects that aim to tame and domesticate efforts to enact progress through practices of control often make a form of wildness in the sense of things gone out of control, of proliferating, of having unexpected consequences, and of things going amiss. And that's a use of the term wild that, for me, that I draw from the work of Deborah Bird-Rose, an Australian philosopher and anthropologist.
I just wanted to finish going back to the film and to the cinematographic tone and aesthetic, which is also another important layer that you, Sonia, are bringing into the subject. And it has this ghost atmosphere. It has the use of the microlens with very beautiful close-up of some of these invertebrate. There is also this large fluid footage under the water that are avoiding this land from above. And there is also the textures that I love it, both of the water, of this muddy water full of life, turb, as well of the transparency of some of the same waters, or other waters, but within the canal, and as well as of some of the animals, like the clam, this image that we were mentioning before. And there is an interesting, I think, juxtaposition of these turbid and transparency. And my question was very much about the decision to present the unseen life of the water. It's a very different image of the water, no?
I think that, well, first, like, just to comment a little bit on this idea between transparency and turbidity or sedimentation, like that was also to reflect on my own experience when I was filming, and what canal are this sort of like shifting landscape that are never really settled. And some spaces will be more transparent, some spaces will suddenly be churned by the motor of narrowboats. So it's also about, like I said previously, like bringing forth this sort of the patchiness. Yeah, the idea of showing the macro life, it came a lot with my interaction and collaboration also with Paul Wood, who kind of pointed at me at those little macroinvertebrate that lives in the water, and how, first of all, his sheer passion about them and how he knows the name of all of them. That was really fascinating, but also how they actually are indicator of water quality, indicator of habitat, indicator of lots of things. And so I wanted to also bring this into the film, into how those beings can tell us something also about the environment. And also, I mean, something that is always very dear to me to try and express in my work, and Heather and I have been also speaking a lot about, is how also we can shift from this understanding of a separation between organism and environment to thinking about the relationship that constitute the earth, or constitute a waterscape, that assemblage as something that is actually sustaining life as we know it. So it actually matters what lives in the water, and that's what the film is trying to also show and say.
Thank you very, very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
Heather, Sonia, Maria, thank you.